Picture this. You're standing in a forest roughly 2 million years ago. You're hungry. Actually, you're always hungry because that's just the default setting for early humans. There's no fridge, no fire, no seasoning, nothing. Your dinner options are raw roots, tough leaves, and if you're lucky, a chunk of meat you tore off a carcass before a hyena chased you away from it. Now imagine chewing that meat. Really imagine it. Cold, stringy, borderline impossible to break down, and about as appetizing as gnawing on a shoelace. And yet, somehow, from this miserable culinary starting point, humanity eventually invented barbecue, birthday cake, and 3-hour cooking competition shows. How did we get from raw shoelace meat to souffle? Stick around because today we're digging into one of the most underrated turning points in human history, the moment our ancestors decided to start putting food near fire, and how that single decision may have quietly rewired the entire course of human evolution. Before we go further, let's clear up a common misconception. A lot of people assume cooking was just some convenient little upgrade, like ancient humans discovered fire and thought, hey, this makes food taste better. Neat. That framing massively undersells what actually happened. Cooking wasn't just a lifestyle improvement, it was arguably one of the single most transformative technologies in the history of our species. Right up there with tool making and language. Some researchers even argue that without cooking, the human brain as we know it simply wouldn't exist. Yeah, we're going there today. So let's start with the basics. Fire itself wasn't invented by humans, obviously. Wildfires have existed for hundreds of millions of years, long before anything resembling a human walked the earth. What changed wasn't the existence of fire, it was our relationship with it. At some point, early hominins went from being terrified of fire, which is the correct and healthy response to a wall of flames, to being curious about it, and eventually to controlling it. That's a massive leap. Evidence of controlled fire use goes back at least 1 million years, with some archaeological sites suggesting even earlier dates that are still hotly debated among researchers, pun fully intended. One of the most famous pieces of evidence comes from a cave in South Africa called Wonderwork Cave, where archaeologists found burned bone fragments and ash deposits dating back roughly 1 million years, deep inside the cave, far from any natural fire source like lightning strikes. That detail matters a lot. A wildfire doesn't wander a kilometer into a pitch-black cave and start a cozy little campfire. That kind of fire has to be carried in, deliberately, by someone who understood what fire was and how to keep it going. Somewhere around that time, early humans stopped being afraid of the thing that could burn down an entire forest and started thinking, actually, I could use this. Now here's where things get really interesting, because there's a theory championed heavily by primatologist Richard Wrangham called the cooking hypothesis, and it argues that cooking wasn't just a nice bonus for early humans, it was the actual driving force behind one of the biggest physical transformations in our evolutionary history. Let's break down why. Raw food is expensive to digest. Not expensive in money, obviously, expensive in energy. Your gut has to work incredibly hard to break down raw meat and raw plant fibers, which means a huge chunk of the calories you're eating gets burned right back up just trying to process the meal. Cooking changes that equation dramatically. When you heat food, you break down proteins, soften plant fibers, and essentially pre-digest a chunk of the work your stomach would otherwise have to do. That means cooked food delivers more usable calories, more efficiently, for less physical effort. Basically, cooking is nature's way of letting you eat the same meal, but keep more of the energy for yourself instead of paying a massive digestive tax on it. And here's why that matters so much. The human brain is an absolute energy hog. It makes up about 2% of your total body weight, but consumes roughly 20% of your daily energy, even when you're just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. Which, let's be honest, some days is a personal specialty. That is an enormous, unusual metabolic cost for an organ to demand. Most animals simply cannot afford to run a brain that expensive because they need that energy for digestion, movement, and just staying alive long enough to reproduce. Wrangham's theory argues that cooking essentially freed up the energy budget. Once early humans started cooking food, digestion became cheaper, which meant more spare calories were suddenly available. And evolution, being the ruthless efficiency expert that it is, apparently looked at that surplus energy and said, let's dump this into bigger brains. This lines up disturbingly well with the fossil record. Around the time controlled fire use starts appearing more consistently in the archaeological timeline, we also start seeing significant changes in early human anatomy. Brain size expands. Gut size, on the other hand, actually shrinks. That second part is huge and often overlooked. A smaller gut is a big deal because digestive tissue is metabolically expensive too. So, shrinking it while simultaneously growing a giant energy hungry brain only makes sense if something changed to make food dramatically easier to digest. Cooking fits that gap perfectly, almost suspiciously perfectly. Teeth and jaws changed too. Compare the skull of an early hominin species like Australopithecus to Homo erectus, one of the first humans strongly associated with regular fire use. And the difference is honestly kind of dramatic. Australopithecus had massive jaw muscles, huge molars built for grinding down tough raw plant material for hours a day, basically living in a permanent state of chewing. Homo erectus, by comparison, had noticeably smaller teeth, a smaller jaw, and a flatter face. Cooking softened food enough that our ancestors simply didn't need those industrial strength chewing tools anymore. Some researchers estimate that raw food eating primates today, like chimpanzees, spend nearly half of their entire day just chewing. Half the day. Just chewing. Meanwhile, modern humans spend, maybe an hour eating on a normal day, and that's if we're being generous and including snack breaks. Cooking didn't just change what we ate, it gave our ancestors back several hours of their day that used to be spent doing nothing but grinding food between molars like a very unglamorous, very slow blender. And that free time matters more than you'd think. Hours previously spent chewing raw, fibrous plants could now be spent on other things: tool making, socializing, exploring, teaching skills to children, all activities that, over enormous stretches of time, likely contributed to the increasingly complex social structures and technological development that define our species. Basically, cooking may have accidentally invented spare time, and spare time may have accidentally invented civilization. Slightly dramatic, sure, but not entirely inaccurate. Let's talk meat for a second, because meat and fire have a particularly interesting relationship in human evolution. Raw meat is tough, genuinely difficult to tear apart with human teeth, which are honestly kind of unimpressive compared to a lot of other predators. We don't have the sharp shearing teeth of a lion or the crushing jaw strength of a hyena. Early humans eating raw meat likely had to rely heavily on stone tools just to cut it into manageable pieces. And even then, digesting raw meat efficiently is a genuinely difficult task for the human gut. Cooking meat breaks down connective tissue and denatures proteins, making it significantly easier to chew and dramatically more efficient to digest. Some studies estimate that cooking meat can increase the net caloric value your body actually absorbs by a pretty significant margin compared to eating it raw. So cooked meat wasn't just tastier, and let's be honest, it almost certainly was tastier. It was a genuine caloric upgrade, delivering more usable energy for the exact same amount of food. In a world where every single calorie mattered for survival, that's not a small advantage. That's potentially the difference between a rough season and a fatal one. Now, let's address something people often assume incorrectly, which is that fire was mainly used for warmth and protection from predators first, and cooking came later as an afterthought. The reality is these things were probably tangled together from the very beginning, reinforcing each other rather than happening in some neat, tidy sequence. Fire kept predators away at night, which meant early humans could sleep on the ground instead of climbing trees for safety. Shift, some researchers argue, significantly changed human sleep patterns and social sleeping arrangements. Fire provided warmth, which allowed early humans to migrate into colder climates they otherwise couldn't have survived in. And fire, of course, transformed food. All three of these benefits were happening around the same campfires, probably discovered somewhat simultaneously through trial, error, and a whole lot of very lucky accidents involving food that fell too close to the flames. Speaking of accidents, it's worth pausing to appreciate just how unglamorous the actual discovery of cooking probably was. Nobody woke up one day and had a genius epiphany about protein denaturation. It was almost certainly something far more mundane: meat left too close to a wildfire, a root that fell into embers and got fished back out smelling incredible, someone hungry enough to try eating the slightly charred result instead of throwing it away. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Over countless repeated accidental discoveries like that, across probably tens of thousands of years and multiple different hominin populations, humans slowly pieced together the fact that heat did something remarkable to food. It made things softer, safer, and significantly more delicious. There was no light bulb moment. It was more like an extremely long, extremely slow group project that nobody ever got proper credit for. Let's also talk about something people rarely think about: food safety. Raw meat and raw plants carry a genuinely dangerous amount of bacteria, parasites, and toxins. Cooking kills most of that off. In a world with no antibiotics, no hospitals, and no way to treat a nasty parasitic infection beyond hoping it goes away on its own, this benefit cannot be overstated. A single bad parasite could take down an otherwise perfectly healthy adult in a world where survival already had incredibly thin margins. Cooking essentially functioned as ancient food safety inspection, dramatically reducing the odds of getting sick from your dinner. Some researchers argue this alone could have provided enough of a survival advantage to spread cooking behavior rapidly through early human populations, even before anyone understood a single thing about germs or bacteria. They didn't need a microscope to notice that people who ate cooked meat got sick less often than people who didn't. That correlation alone was more than enough to change behavior across generations. There's also a fascinating social dimension to all of this that tends to get overlooked in favor of the more flashy brain size arguments. Cooking, unlike grabbing a raw handful of berries while walking, requires a dedicated location. You need a fire. Fire needs to be maintained, fed, and protected from wind and rain. That means cooking essentially forces a group to gather in one specific spot for an extended period of time. And when you get a group of early humans sitting together around a fire, waiting for food to cook, you get something incredibly valuable that raw food eating on the move simply doesn't provide: downtime for social interaction. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies consistently find that mealtimes, especially cooked meals prepared and eaten together, function as major social bonding events. Stories get told, relationships get built, social hierarchies get reinforced or challenged. Children learn skills by watching adults. None of that happens quite the same way when everyone's just wandering around individually snacking on raw leaves throughout the day. In a very real sense, the campfire might be one of the very first social institutions in human history, predating language as we know it, predating religion, predating basically everything we associate with organized human culture. This ties into another massive shift: the division of labor. Cooking requires certain tasks: gathering fuel, tending the fire, preparing food, and these tasks could be divided among group members rather than everyone individually foraging and eating on their own schedule. Some researchers argue this early cooperative structure around cooking and fire maintenance may have contributed to more complex social organization within early human groups, essentially an ancient prototype of teamwork that eventually scaled up into the wildly complicated societies we live in today. Somewhere back then, someone was assigned fire duty, and honestly, that person deserves way more historical credit than they ever received. Let's shift gears and talk about sleep, because this is a genuinely underrated consequence of controlled fire. Before fire, once the sun went down, early humans were largely at the mercy of darkness and predators, likely retreating to trees or defensible locations for safety. Fire changed the entire nighttime equation. A controlled fire kept predators at bay, provided light, and allowed groups to remain active and social well after sunset. Some researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer sleep patterns have found that firelit evenings are often filled with storytelling, music, and social bonding, activities that tend to happen far less during the physically demanding daylight hours spent hunting and gathering. In other words, controlled fire may have single-handedly created humanity's very first primetime television slot, except the content was oral storytelling and the screen was, well, a burning log. Now let's bring this back to brain development specifically, because there's another piece of the puzzle worth mentioning. The fact that cooked food isn't just easier for adults to digest, it's dramatically easier for children to digest too. Human children, compared to other primates, are born incredibly underdeveloped and require years of intensive feeding and care before they're anywhere close to self-sufficient. A toddler simply does not have the jaw strength or digestive capability to efficiently process tough raw meat and fibrous raw plants. Cooked food, being softer and easier to digest, would have made weaning and early childhood nutrition dramatically more manageable, potentially allowing human mothers to wean children earlier and have more offspring across their reproductive lifespan compared to species locked into a raw food diet. If that's true, cooking may have quietly influenced not just brain size, but actual human population growth and reproductive strategy. Somewhere in that shift, cooking wasn't just feeding individual humans, it was fueling entire population booms. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how strange it is from a broader animal kingdom perspective that humans are pretty much the only species that cooks its food. Every other animal on the planet eats things raw, straight from the source, no preparation required. We are, as far as we know, entirely unique among the roughly 8 million estimated species on this planet in our habit of applying heat to our meals before eating them. That's a genuinely bizarre evolutionary quirk when you step back and think about it. Somewhere along the line, one particular species of primate looked at fire, decided it was less scary than useful, and permanently altered its entire biology, culture, and daily routine around that decision. No other species did that, not chimps, not dolphins, not crows, despite all of them being remarkably intelligent in their own right. Cooking might genuinely be one of the strangest and most defining behaviors that separates humans from literally every other living thing on Earth. Of course, it's worth acknowledging that not every researcher fully agrees with just how early or how central cooking was to human brain evolution. The cooking hypothesis is influential, but it remains actively debated within the scientific community, partly because definitive archaeological evidence of truly widespread, habitual, everyday fire use doesn't become abundantly clear in the fossil record until a bit later than the timeline Wrangham's theory would ideally need to fully explain the earliest brain size increases. Some researchers argue other factors like increased meat consumption in general, even if eaten raw, combined with improved tool use for processing food, might have kicked off the initial stages of brain growth, with cooking arriving slightly later and then accelerating and locking in those gains even further. The honest scientific answer here is that we don't have a perfectly clean, universally agreed upon timeline, and that's okay. Prehistory rarely hands us a neat little bow-wrapped answer. Most of the time, we're piecing together a puzzle from fragments of bone, ash, and educated inference. And reasonable experts can look at the same fragments and draw slightly different conclusions. Let's talk for a moment about a related piece of the puzzle that often gets overshadowed by the brain size conversation: water and starch. Cooking, particularly boiling one's containers, eventually entered the picture much later in human history, allowed access to a whole category of nutrients that raw preparation simply couldn't unlock efficiently. Certain root vegetables, for example, contain starches that are borderline indigestible when raw, locked away inside tough cellular walls that human digestive enzymes struggle to break through. Heat ruptures those cell walls, releasing the starches inside and making them dramatically easier for the body to absorb. Without cooking, huge categories of otherwise abundant, calorie-dense foods would have remained essentially useless to early humans, tantalizingly present in the landscape, but nutritionally locked behind a wall only fire could open. There's also a chemical safety angle worth mentioning, since a surprising number of wild plants that were otherwise nutritious contained natural toxins as a built in defense mechanism against being eaten. Many of these toxic compounds break down or become significantly less potent when exposed to heat. This means cooking didn't just make existing food more digestible, it actively expanded the total number of edible plant species available to early humans, opening up entire new food sources that would have been off limits or downright dangerous to eat raw. In a sense, fire acted like a universal key, unlocking pantries that had been sitting there the whole time, just waiting for someone brave enough or hungry enough to figure out the trick. Let's also spend a moment on tools, because cooking and toolmaking seem to have evolved hand in hand rather than one simply following the other. Early stone tools were already being used to butcher meat and process plants long before regular fire use appears in the archaeological record, which means early humans were already deeply invested in the idea of processing food before eating it, cutting, pounding, scraping. Cooking essentially became the next logical step in a process humans were already committed to. Once you've accepted the idea that food benefits from a little preparation before it hits your mouth, tossing it near a fire isn't that big of a conceptual leap. In some ways, cooking might be better understood not as a totally separate invention, but as the natural evolution of a much older habit of manipulating food before eating it, one that stretches back even further than fire itself. It's also worth considering how cooking likely influenced group size and territory. Larger, more reliable calorie surpluses from cooked food could support larger group sizes, since more efficiently extracted energy means more mouths can be fed from the same amount of foraged or hunted material. Larger groups, in turn, generally mean more collective knowledge, more division of labor, more protection from predators and rival groups, and more opportunities for social learning to pass between individuals. Some researchers speculate that the shift toward larger, more socially complex group sizes among certain hominin species may be partially tied to the increased caloric efficiency cooking provided. It's a chain reaction, really. Fire leads to easier digestion leads to caloric surplus. Caloric surplus supports larger groups, and larger groups drive increasingly complex social and cognitive demands, which, conveniently, ties right back into that expensive, energy-hungry brain we mentioned earlier, needing to get even more sophisticated just to keep up with all the new social complexity. What we can say with much more confidence is that once cooking did become a regular, consistent part of human life, its effects rippled outward into nearly every aspect of who we became as a species. Our jaws got smaller, our guts got smaller, our brains got bigger, our social structures got more complex, our diets became more flexible and varied, allowing humans to survive in an enormous range of environments, from freezing tundra to scorching desert, largely because cooking made previously inedible or difficult to digest foods suddenly accessible. Roots that would be nearly impossible to digest raw became a reliable food source once cooked. Toxic compounds in certain plants could be broken down and neutralized through cooking, opening up entirely new categories of food that simply weren't available to our ancestors before. Cooking, in a very real sense, dramatically expanded the human menu, and an expanded menu meant humans could survive and thrive in places that would have been completely off limits to a species stuck eating everything raw. There's something almost poetic about the fact that a behavior born from hunger and desperation and probably a whole lot of trial and error ended up becoming one of the most universal, most joyful parts of human culture today. Every single culture on this planet, without exception, has developed its own unique cuisine, its own cooking traditions, its own rituals and celebrations built entirely around fire and food. Birthdays, weddings, holidays, funerals, pretty much every major human life event throughout history has involved gathering people together around cooked food. That thread traces all the way back to a group of early hominins huddled around a flickering fire a million years ago, tossing a scrap of meat into the flames because, frankly, they were hungry and mildly curious, with absolutely no idea they were setting off a chain reaction that would eventually lead to bigger brains, complex societies, and, several 100,000 years later, extremely competitive baking shows judged entirely on presentation and soggy bottoms. So, why did ancient humans begin cooking? The honest answer is a combination of hunger, curiosity, opportunity, and a healthy dose of accidental discovery, layered together over an almost unimaginably long stretch of time. But the consequences of that decision reshaped nearly everything about what it means to be human. Our bodies changed, our brains grew, our social lives transformed, our diets expanded into territory no raw food eating species could ever access. All because at some point, a very hungry, very curious ancestor of ours decided that fire wasn't just something to be afraid of. It was something worth using. So the next time you're standing over a stove, or firing up a grill, or even just microwaving last night's leftovers at 11 at night because you got hungry out of nowhere, take a second to appreciate what you're actually participating in. You're continuing a tradition that stretches back roughly a million years, one that quite possibly built the very brain you're using to read this sentence right now. That's a pretty wild legacy for something that probably started with a piece of meat that accidentally fell into a fire. If you found this as fascinating as I did digging into it, let me know down in the comments which part surprised you most because honestly, the shrinking gut and growing brain trade off still blows my mind every time I think about it. And if you want more deep dives into the strange, surprising forces that quietly shaped human history, you know exactly what to do.